Well, hello everyone and welcome back to another It's Not Rocket Science with me, Lindsay Setchell. And today I'm going to talk to you about fronts versus hind feet. Oh, my board's a bit creaky. Fronts versus hind feet and the common trimming errors that we find. Now, I'm going to draw my version of the front and the back foot in the moment, and then we're going to talk about what we commonly see out in the field, which are presented oftentimes as a fault from the horse, but in actual fact are being caused because of very, very common trimming errors. So that's what we're going to do today. Fronts versus hinds and those common trimming errors. Okay, so let's get rid of my rocket. Okay, so let's get into it. Now I'm going to put a little dividing line down here. Now on this side we're going to have the front, and on this side we're going to have the hinds. Okay, now the big issue that we have is that when we go out into the field we don't see much uniform commonality between the two. Now that's interesting because if you actually look at the horse's foot, that's the front foot, and let's go and have a look at the hind foot. That's effectively what we should be seeing. Something, they're not the same size of course, something which is very, very similar. Now if we were to draw P3 in here, and I'm going to draw it with the red, I don't know whether that's going to come up, maybe not, I think I'll draw it with the blue this time because the red's not coming up. So if we were to draw P3 in here, it should be running parallel with the dorsal wall and as close to ground parallel as we can get it. Okay, that's a balanced foot. It might not look balanced on my drawing, but that's what it's meant to be. And if we look at the hind foot, we have a similar situation going on, okay? Now there's a reason for that. There's a big reason for that, and that reason is anatomy. Because both the front and the hind feet both have exactly the same anatomy, exactly the same. From the lower limb down, you've got two limbs at the front and two limbs at the back that you can hardly tell the difference. When we do our cadaver workshops and we have they cut them off at the hock or at the knee, and we look at these animals, it's difficult to tell. One, it's a left or a right, but there are ways of doing that by looking at the tendons, the extensor tendon. And two, whether it's a front or a back. Now the usual presentation for a front and a back is that the front tends to be a little bit rounder. It tends to be a little bit rounder, whereas the hind tends to be a little bit narrower. So that's a tiny bit narrower. And so when we look at them underneath, we can see often that there's a little bit of a change in morphology, and that's because of a slight change in the morphology of the P3, of the pedal bone, the coffin bone. They can be slightly more upright, they can be slightly more elongated, they can be slightly narrower, and they can certainly have a difference in their concavity as well. And that reflects in the hoof capsule that is growing around it, because the hoof capsule is like one of those Russian dolls. The hoof capsule is just a larger version of P3 inside. So this really shouldn't be that different. So when you're looking at your horse's feet and everybody's obsessing over the fronts because we've had issues with the front feet, a good thing to do is trim up the hinds and go and have a look at the hinds. Now there are ponies out there and horses out there that have horrible distortions in their hind feet too, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But commonly the problems that we have are hoof capsule divergence on the fronts causing tearing of the laminae, and on the hinds we have what we call negative palmar angle with P3 going in the other direction. So let's see if we can draw that. So this would be more normal. So this would be more normal. And what we commonly see out in the field is something a bit like this. So we have a toe, a wall coming down, and we have a toe that's a little bit more chopped off, not so much on the concavity, and then we have heels that are much higher. And that's an extremely common presentation of the hoof capsule on a front foot. On a hind foot, what we tend to have is we tend to have a bit more of a sloping dorsal wall, and then as we come up here, we have a lower heel, and we have that kind of presentation, a bit similar to when they call our long toe, low heel trims. But the difference with this is that there is too much material at the toe. And here, there's too much material at the heels, and they've taken the toe away. Here, they've left the toe, but they've taken more heel. So there's too much at the toe here. Too much toe. And here, we've got too much heel and not enough toe. So not enough toe, and sometimes it's not enough heel, but oftentimes with the hind feet, actually they've got an absolutely fine heel. The problem is they're not being balanced dorsopalmally. So dorsopalmally, let's draw P3 in, because let's turn that up here a little bit. My creaky board. Let's draw P3 in. So in this instance, we're starting to get divergence. So we're starting to have a situation where, because of the heel height, the palmar angle is going up. If we go across here, this palmar angle is going up because the heels, this is what we call the palmar angle, from looking at the base of P3 relative to the bottom of the foot. So as the heels go up, so does P3 at the back. It becomes more positive. And while that's happening, we're taking more toe off. That causes a growth rate disparity. And if you go back and you have a look at the It's Not Rocket Science lesson that I did last week, I talk about how horses' feet get to this stage. And it's trimming errors. It's all down to people obsessing about the toe and taking the toe off and leaving the heel too high because they're so, ironically, they're so afraid of taking heel compared to taking toe, which is quite interesting, really. But when we get to the hind foot, we have a slightly different presentation. And what we start to see at the hind foot is we start to see what we call, let's see if I can draw that in a bit more obvious. We start to see what we call a negative palmar angle. There we go. But an interesting thing here is that we're not seeing separation between the dorsal face of the hoof capsule and the face of P3. We don't see separation there. And one of the reasons for that is the growth rates. On a hind foot, if you don't take off the toe, if you don't remove that toe pillar here from the ground, if you don't remove this toe pillar from the ground, and you also have the heels on the ground as well, those growth rates, even though the foot is out of balance, those growth rates, I'm so hot, those growth rates tend to be quite even. And that's a good thing for the hoof capsule, because that means that when you get a situation like this, you can correct it really quite quickly. If the heels have not been taken down too low, and they do take them down too low very occasionally, but the more common presentation that we see is that the heels are in the right position. They've just left too much mass, and that's because they're not entirely sure about that dorsopalmar balance as they look forward. And when they leave too much mass here, you end up having this negative presentation, but you don't get the stretch. The stretch comes when you create this kind of foot. When you take off this toe here, and you definitely start to leave too much heel here. This starts to strike the ground first. In this instance here, even with the long toe, the horse will attempt to land much, much flatter than it would do with its front feet. And you can see that, you can, like I said in the last It's Not Rocket Science lesson, you can you'll put your camera on slow-mo and just have the horse walking back and forth. And you'll often find the hind feet are landing much flatter than the front feet. And that's because we have this extra heel here and we've taken away this toe. And that has caused this growth rate issue. We have the the hinds going fast and we have the toe going slow. And we have this positive presentation of P3. And that's what starts to cause all the strain and stress inside the capsule. And that's what starts to cause the pain. And if you go and look at my last one, I talk about my last It's Not Rocket Science lesson. I talk about how these horses go from this to this, and then they get even more severe and more divergent because even more toe is taken off because they panic about the toe, thinking that it's the toe that's causing the tearing. Well, funny that, because when these horses' feet on their hinds are left too long, you don't get tearing of the laminae. Now that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Yet they don't chop these toes off anywhere close to what they do with the front feet. Now, laminitis is seen as a metabolic problem. You're not going to see that very well, are you? Laminitis. It's seen as a metabolic issue. Well, this horse has hind feet and it has front feet, and there's no great big wall down the middle of them, not like I've drawn here. And so metabolism doesn't just be choosy and pick particular feet. And what we see is I've just drawn 2 feet here, but the horse's 4 feet will be all slightly different. If you x-rayed the hinds and they're being trimmed by this person and they're being left slightly negative, and we call that, what do we call it? We call it an NPA. So a negative palmar angle. We have a negative palmar angle here. And the fix is to start understanding that this part needs to be removed. Now that's ironic, isn't it? Because here we are being told that the toes are too long on the fronts, and that must be what's causing tearing, yet on the hinds, when they're often left too long, it doesn't cause any tearing at all. It's not pleasant for the horse. It causes all sorts of issues and the horse is extremely compromised, but it doesn't cause tearing. Yet when this here is positive and then we start messing around with the toe and we start changing the growth rates, that's when you start to get the issues with the laminae. Now you've been told again that it's metabolic, that it's diet, that those are the reasons. In order to absolutely be completely 100% sure about that, you'd have to take a capsule like this and a capsule like this and expect to see separation with no change to the capsule. And that never happens. Never happens. When we see separation on these positive presentations of P3, what we're actually seeing is a hoof capsule divergence caused by the change in the growth rates and the constant intervention and the belief that the long toe is causing issues and then not knowing where it's causing tearing issues and then not knowing where the actual hinds, the actual heel should be. But on the hind foot, we have the opposite. Now, normally, the really tragic thing is there are horses walking around, many hundreds upon thousands of horses walking around this earth, domestic horses, with this presentation, just one horse. And the front 2 feet are slightly different. You get more positive on one than you do on the other. And commonly what we see is that the right foot tends to be the one that will have more of a positive P3 than the left. And that's because most people are right-handed. And then what we see on the hind feet is that we'll see one foot often is more negative than the other. Now that's not just because the horse is walking funny, because the horse isn't moving enough. I mean, if the horse was moving enough, he would be able to keep on top of the horn that's produced, and the amount of horn that's taken away by the ground would be in equilibrium. But unfortunately, that's not the case with our domestic horses. So what we end up with is this problem at the bottom. And it fluctuates at every single trim. It doesn't matter whether these horses are on a 3-week cycle, a 6-week cycle, or oftentimes the hinds are left and the fronts aren't. It doesn't matter what cycle they're on. If the person that is trimming is not trimming to that horse's anatomy, e.g. the bones, e.g. P3, then you're left guessing what the hoof capsule should look like. And this is the most common presentation that we see. Positive in the front and negative in the back. And that is all down to trimming errors. Well, I hope you liked that short It's Not Rocket Science lesson. I'll be back next week for a little bit more. See you then. Bye-bye.